and welcome to day 2 of the third edition of the Asia-Europe Sustainable Connectivity Scientific Conference, AESCON 3, titled Shaping Asia-Europe Pathways for Human-Centric and Resilient Digital Connectivity. Today, we will hear from leading Asian and European experts on cybersecurity, as well as disaster preparedness and resilience. This event was made possible thanks to the support of the European Union in cooperation with the Asia-Europe Foundation in Singapore, the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS, in Brussels, as well as in partnership with the Sejong Institute in Seoul and the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia in Jakarta. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. As you can see, your microphones have been turned off. However, each panel discussion will be followed by a Q&A session, and we invite you to leave your questions using the AESCON Q&A chat. For any other inquiry, the AESCON Help Desk and Info Team chats are available. Lastly, please be aware that this session is being recorded. And now we can move on to today's first panel discussion, Securing Resilience Through Cybersecurity Cooperation, led by the Sejong Institute, our partner in South Korea. I am pleased to pass the floor to Dr. Seoyeon Shin, who is a research fellow at the Sejong Institute's National Intelligence and Cybersecurity Center. Seoyeon, over to you.
Thank you, Fanny. I am Seoyeon. Very nice to meet you all, the panelists and audiences today, even in the virtual meeting. I also want to appreciate all the technician team members helping us behind the screen. Thank you for having me here as a moderator. It is an honorable chance to exchange various opinions with the international experts and to expand the knowledges and understanding about cybersecurity issues. In this session, we will talk about how to secure resilience through cybersecurity cooperation. As we all know, there could be a variety of types of a possible cyber cooperation: bilateral, multilateral, regional, interregional, and international, also between private sector and public sector too, etc., etc. Then the details and dynamics of a cybersecurity cooperation would differ from the types of cooperation. So in this session, the speakers will suggest the various points. For example, why do we need to cooperate to secure cyber resilience? What kind of best practice have we witnessed until now? And what kind of actors are playing in the resilience part? And also, what type of cooperation could be successful or more efficient in securing cyber resilience? And what kind of problems and pros and cons could appear during cooperation, etc., etc. And before kicking off the presentations, I, as a moderator, would like to cast a very basic and common question to all our speakers. What is cyber resilience? And, you know, there is no confirmed definition of resilience yet. And then how could you define resilience in cybersecurity in your own term? So for cybersecurity cooperation, I think we need to share a common understanding to some extent what resilience means in cyber. In this regard, I would like to ask each speaker to briefly talk about their own definition of resilience shortly before moving on to the full-scale presentation. Okay, and then, all right, let's then move on. I am very delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lorenzo Pupillo. He is the head of cybersecurity at CEPS Initiative, and he is an economist by training and has worked in many areas of telecommunication demand and regulatory analysis, publishing 4 books on internet policy and many papers in applied econometrics and industrial organizations. He has served as an advisor to the Global Information and Communication Technologies Department of the World Bank. Before joining SAPS, he served as an executive director in the Public and Regulatory Affairs unit of Telecom Italia, developing the company's global public policies for internet, cybersecurity, and next-generation networks. He also managed the Telecom Italia's relations with the OECD, the ITU, and other international associations and organizations. Dr. Pupillo is also an affiliated researcher at Columbia Institute for Teleinformation at Columbia Business School and serves on numerous scientific and advisory boards around the globe. He obtained a PhD and MA from University of Pennsylvania and Master of Science in Mathematics from University of Rome. Lorenzo, this is your floor.
Okay, so Shun, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Just briefly, to answer your question, what is resilience, in particular cyber resilience? I have to say I like very much a definition that I found in a report by the National Intelligence Council in 2017, the Global Trends for Paradox of Progress. Basically, the idea is that we live in a paradox, in a situation in which technology is allowing us to have a substantial breakthrough, but at the same time, we have also, an increasing number of threats that they are related to the massive diffusion of this technology. So basically, resilience means to be able, to move with rather than against these historical changes that this paradoxical project is implying. And being resilient means to invest in infrastructure, knowledge, and relationship that allow the state to manage a shock, whether they are economic, environmental, society, and cyber. This basically means that cyber are the same dignity in terms of lens to analyze what's happening in the world, the economic, environment, and society. This is my definition.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And then, would you please move on to your own presentation?
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm going to do today for my presentation, basically, I on the slide, I want to basically make 2 points. First of all, why we need cybersecurity cooperation to achieve resilience. The second point is how to make viable cybersecurity cooperation, especially between the EU and Asia. First item, why we need cybersecurity cooperation? We need basically for 2 reasons. The first one, because we need the cooperation to achieve resilience, we need to handle the global nature of threat. In recent years, the number of cyber attacks has increased dramatically, and this attack entail the supply chains aiming at cyber espionage, ransomware, or disruption. The case in point is the SolarWinds supply chain attack that affected more than 18,000 organizations globally, including government agencies and major companies. Now, what is clear that this global significant cybersecurity incident can be too disruptive for a single or several affected states to handle alone. For that reason, it's important to strengthen solidarity at the broader level among states. Okay, and the key is information sharing. Now, the other issue is that we need the cybersecurity cooperation to handle the global nature of a threat, but also because we have to be clear on this. The cybersecurity market are strongly characterized by many market failures. In particular, one of these market failures is free riding that works against information sharing, that instead is required to guarantee resilience. Free ride means basically that the benefit of disclosing information are slow to arrive and benefit all organizations equally, even our competitive organization. As such, an organization optimal choice will be to avoid exposing itself to share information while keeping enjoying the benefit deriving from someone else's disclosure. So, cooperation will help information sharing and mitigate the market failure. What I also make clear that so far, where has been put in place, cybersecurity cooperation to achieve resilience has worked. And the case in point is Ukraine. Dr. Milani will go in more detail on this, but definitely we have to say that Ukrainians have shown not only a fierce resistance on the battlefield, but also a great resilience of the digital infrastructure, especially in the cyber realm. Okay, and against our expectation, cyber attacks since the invasion have been limited in scope and scale in Ukraine. And this has been achieved not only because the Ukrainian government started years ago to increase the Ukrainian cybersecurity posture, but also because there has been a tremendous effort in terms of cooperation between the private and the public sector, led by the EU and the USA. There was a great public-private partnership. Microsoft provided threat analysis, Tesla Starlink connection. Experts from the EU rapid response team have been deployed in Ukraine, adding to the support provided by the US. The US secretly removed malware worldwide, disrupting botnet and preempting Russian cyber attacks. At a domestic level, there have been warnings in the USA from the president of the US against Russian cyber attack. The EU did the same. So, cooperation, especially private-public cooperation, works very well. Now, the second point is how to make viable cybersecurity cooperation, especially between the EU and Asia. Well, this can be done creating trust among the cooperation partners, basically, I would say, through shared global norms and standards. Now, if we look at the current situation in terms of sharing global norms, we have to say the situation is quite static at the moment. We have global norms on cybercrime. And when we mention this, we refer to the Cybercrime Convention or the Budapest Convention. We have to say that as of April 2023, 68 countries have so far ratified the Budapest Convention on cybercrime, 22 years after its official adoption. We have to be candid on this, that at this rate, it will take quite a few decades to have the majority of the world nations sign it. For instance, Russia does not agree with Article 32 of the Convention concerning transborder access to stored computer data. It is proposing another treaty based on this convention. China, India, and Brazil refused to sign since they were not involved in the negotiation. You see the convention as a fait accompli being forced upon them. So we have to take this into account. When we look at the effort it's made globally for the introduction of global norms for responsible state behavior, this is something that's done in the open-ended working group at the UN that operates under the first committee of the UN General Assembly. It's not a legal binding unit, but the agreed language is very helpful in identify the responsible behavior of government in cyberspace. This group has concluded its fourth session in March in New York. The meeting was very interesting because marked by a growing engagement by member states and a rich discussion on various aspects of international cybersecurity, ranging from threat assessment, confidence building, major capacity building, institutional dialogue. We are expecting now the annual progress report in July, but there are some major divergences remain in the position of states and stakeholders, not to mention the continuous showdown that Russia aggression in Ukraine cast over the proceeding. So the situation is an flux. As the EU emphasized in its statement, it's increasingly difficult to demarcate civilian and military dimension cyberspace, as seen in the recent attack on energy network and transport infrastructure. However, we have to say that this context, as I say, is a little bit static. We see some positive initiative played by the EU and some major Asian countries. In the recent year, Japan and India, for example, have entered a number of joint initiatives with the EU, including the bilateral cyber dialogue, the EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership 2019, the India-EU Connectivity Partnership 2021. In April 22, India and the EU announced the launch of a Trade Technology Council, a political platform to develop deeper strategic cooperation in trusted technology and security. We have also to say that, that now there is this great opportunity of the G20, this, with the presidency of India. And India is playing an important role with this presidency to promote a culture of trust and security. From the discussion that, the Sherpa are having on the final document of this G20, we know that there are interesting wording related to cybersecurity, promoting best practice on cyber hygiene, promoting a secure by design approach for digital solution, promoting resilience in digital sector. We have also to say that India is promoting in the context of the G20, a G20 conference on crime and security in the age of NFTs, AI and metaverse in July in Gurugram in India. And so these are all important sign, of, this bilateral type of cooperation. Now, the other, like I said, so we can have cooperation through, development global norms, but also through, joint development of standard for digital infrastructure and product. And for instance, in the India-EU Trade and Technology Council meeting in May of 2023, both partners have decided to engage in 5G telecom and Internet of Things standardization. And, when we think about the Internet of Things, I think this is a very interesting area of potential collaboration, because very recently the EU put forward a great piece of regulation. This is under discussion, the trialogue, and it's the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, that is proposing a common approach to cybersecurity of product with digital element. It includes also non-embedded software. And in basic word, CRA is the first world regulation of IoT in the world, and it's putting forward some cybersecurity requirement and also conformity assessment procedure. This is an area that I see as potential cooperation among the EU and ASA, because many of the products that are sold in the EU comes from the US and from Asia, but to be sold, to be in the EU market, will need to follow some cybersecurity requirement, also some conformity assessment procedure. And so this can be an opportunity to work on this cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Hello?
very much.
Ah.
Thank you very much
Okay.
for your insightful and broad presentation, Dr. Lorenzo. And then he just outlined why we need international cooperation for cyber resilience, and then especially he emphasized the kind of the interregional cooperation between Asia and Europe in terms of norm setting in cyber resilience, and then he emphasized the necessity of the interregional cyber cooperation. And then I will introduce our second speaker, Dr. Melanie Garson. Dr. Melanie Garson is the cyber policy lead and acting director of the geopolitics at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Her work focuses on cyber policy, the geopolitics of the internet, the rise of tech companies as geopolitical actors, data governance, as well as the intersection of emerging tech, foreign policy, and diplomacy. He's also an associate professor in international conflict resolution and international security in the Department of Political Science at University College London, where she teaches about new emerging technologies and the future conflict in the digital age. Melanie presents regularly at international conferences in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa on the implication of cyber, AI, and emerging technologies on geopolitics and the foreign policy, as well as provides commentary at major media outlets, including BBC, Sky, CNN, etc., etc. Okay, please welcome Melanie, and then it's your turn.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you so much for inviting me to be with you. To rise to your challenge about resilience, for me, my favorite definition of resilience actually comes from Mr. David Koh from the Cybersecurity Authority in Singapore, who last year said that resilience is the ability for any country to be an escalator, not an elevator. So in the sense that if any kind of crisis event hits, that your digital infrastructure and everything connected to it is able to operate, and you don't get stuck like you're in an elevator, and that you'll be able to keep going, albeit slowly. You could do the equivalent of walk up the stairs. So not everything comes to a complete standstill. And I think that's increasingly important and this is some of what I'm going to talk about today when we think about the lessons from Ukraine for coordination resilience. But it becomes increasingly important as more and more countries digitalize, as we're rolling out in different spaces, whether it's digital identity, whether the talk is about AI-enabled tools, as more and more becomes connected to the communications infrastructure, then having that form of backup becomes absolutely critical. And I think coordinating with who we need to do that with is even more important. So that's what I'm going to talk about for a few minutes today. So if I can have actually two next slides. So we've already done that bit, so we could go to the next slide, please. So as you'll see is actually the impact of cyber attacks on Ukraine is still very much felt not only in Ukraine, but also globally. So whilst we think that it's very limited, we're still tracking, and this comes from the Cyber Peace Institute that have done an excellent job of sort of tracking these wider cyber attacks, where they've seen since the start of the war, over 1,408 attacks across 87 countries. In Q1 of this year, we've seen over 475 wide-scale attacks across the world, and that's coming both from state-sponsored entities or association with state-sponsored entities, and it's generally we're seeing an uptick, particularly on critical infrastructure sectors. So it's not something that is uniquely located in Ukraine. Next slide, please. But what we have seen in Ukraine that became evident very quickly from the outset of the conflict is that, in fact, even before the conflict, that there was a new set of actors that had stepped in, that were coordinating with the Ukraine government, with the allies to Ukraine, on really thinking of stepping in to prevent cyber attacks, and also to prevent to also increase the overall resilience of the communications infrastructure and the communication architecture. And thinking from the very sort of the Russian approach to cyber warfare as a whole, it's a very all-encompassing approach, which includes the cyber operations as well as the information layer. And a lot of focus has often been on the information layer, but we have that overall structural resilience that becomes really important. And this has been made largely in the hands of the private actors, of the private companies that had the agility and to be able to come in at speed from the moment the warning signs were coming in. And we know this, that Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, right at the outset, first day of the war, noticed the Foxblade wiper malware about to hit 19 government agencies and was managed to mitigate it before it hit Ukraine at that point. If I can have the next slide, please. So as I just said, that often the conversation about cyber resilience in relation to private companies has been very much largely focused on either the disinformation context or the information warfare, and at some point thinking a little bit at the critical internet hardware and devices. And it has been absolutely crucial where companies have stepped in. And as Lorenzo previously alluded to, we've seen a lot of companies step in and support at that particular level. So whether if we look at Google, for instance, they reported that there was an increase of 250% of phishing attacks in Ukraine, and actually 300% globally. And they've been crucial in neutralizing at that point. At the critical internet and hardware devices, we've seen with, as I alluded to, Microsoft has been part of that. And also companies like Cloudflare saw that in 2022, application layer attacks rose by 1,300%. So that's a massive element of that in February 2022 to February 2023. And they averaged at 10% of all traffic to Ukraine was mitigations of potential attacks. So we're talking about a massive amount of attacks, and those are often the elements that we're seeing reported. And this, as we all know, there's an element of underreporting. Can I have the next slide, please? But the other side of this is we often focus on some of those larger companies at the top level, but we see that there's also the content distribution networks, and the basic providers of the internet backbone services and the access to the structure of the internet. So we know that the biggest case that we heard about very quickly in the beginning of the conflict was obviously Starlink coming in as Russia really sort of obliterated the communications infrastructure, so that they had strategic destruction. In fact, 4,000 mobile base stations. They destroyed thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable, rerouting network traffic deliberately through Russian cables. So finding the alternatives or providing the structure, the resilience to be able to even operate and both cyber defense, but also to protect overall your overall cyber infrastructure became critical. And at the level of moving the data out of the country, which we know that AWS and Microsoft were absolutely critical for, I think, in the sense that Microsoft provided in the sort of realm of, I think, $104 million to be able to help that transition. When, as I mentioned earlier, as we move towards the digitalized services, and for Ukraine in particular, that has DIA, their app, that really has a strong digital identity provision and connected infrastructure, that this became crucial to be able to still provide for people, even during this time of geopolitical crisis. Next slide, please. But what we're seeing and what's interesting with what we're looking at with the private entities being part now, crucially, of building resilience, is that some of the private companies are actually building or consolidating their power, if you want, throughout the internet stack. And that means we're beginning to see internet platforms that also have internet infrastructure throughout, so they're all through the stack. And that means that they're carrying considerable weight in the infrastructure system as a whole, where they can play into cyber defense. And it also means, as we saw in Ukraine, that the consolidation of that and the cooperation between them in the case of with one particular country in a conflict can completely tip the balance of power, both with how they act to protect, but also in how they withdrew. And then we saw this particularly when they had big backbone providers withdrew, like Kogan and Lumen, that came out of Russia, of how that also affected Russia's access to the internet. Now, that's a bigger question of, and there were tensions whether they felt it was right to do so. But nonetheless, it provided that the greater power and the greater access to communications infrastructure was going to give you greater resilience overall. Now, the next slide, please. And this doesn't just relate to thinking about conflict. This happens, there's a range of geopolitical crises. So which we saw with in Tonga, with the volcano that cut out actually the subsea cables, that it took 6 weeks to get the internet back on track. And that's the economic cost of that, particularly when we think about small level businesses operating on Instagram or governments be able to provide services, becomes really critical. And we've seen numerous incidents, particularly within geopolitical context, with like Svalbard, with subsea cables being cut. So countries having some level of backup to their overall cyber infrastructure is becoming increasingly critical. Next slide, please. And so, and as I say, as we overlay this, and particularly all the conversation at the moment is about, you know, generative AI, the tools, and some of the forgotten elements of this is that this still relies on our basic core infrastructure, on our internet. If that's not up and working, it's all the magic, the good we're hoping to do with AI-enabled tools is not going to operate. So we have this increasing levels of vulnerability that needs to be resilient to both malicious attacks, but also through, as noted before, like climatic change or unforeseen vulnerabilities within the infrastructure. Next slide, please. And as a whole, if we're looking at just the attack surface, we know that the attacks are on the increase. This is the June report on ransomware attacks as a whole, just on state and local government. So this is on government infrastructure, which is traditionally one of the weakest sort of protection globally. And as a whole, the global attacks are not declining, even as the Ukraine-Russia is sort of bubbling underneath. We're seeing fragmentation of cyber criminal groups, and particularly those that are moving away from some of the activism related to Russia-Ukraine, and which isn't very lucrative because many of the allied companies have increased their cyber defenses and moving to cyber criminality elsewhere. Next slide, please. And we know from this came from the World Economic Forum, when they sort of surveyed business leaders and sort of with the belief that 93% of cyber leaders, 80% of business leaders believe that there's going to be some type of catastrophic cyber event in the next 2 years. And what was interesting about that study as well was that they also talked about that only 24% of businesses actually believed they were would able to withstand that attack. So thinking about what that could do systemically in any country if there was that kind of incident, again, from a country level, means that we have to be thinking about how do we both enable businesses and the overall architecture to be more resilient. And next slide, please. And as we've seen, that lack of resilience can have far-reaching implications. This time last year, Costa Rica had to declare a national emergency after a massive hack from the Hive ransomware group, from the holding 30 government departments to ransom, to the point that people couldn't get their even medical appointments, that payments to social security payments were frozen. And it was within the days of a new presidency, which fundamentally politically destabilizing, and really the first time we've seen also a non-state actor really interfere with political process and call via Twitter for citizens of Costa Rica to go into the streets and protest their government, tell them to pay a ransom. And it was costing the Costa Rican government $30 million a day because there was no way, there was no backup or the resilience in their system to be able to provide services in any other way. So the implications are massive, and they're still suffering the long tail of the effects of that today. Next slide, please. So what's the problem with this? And thinking about this, and particularly thinking about the Ukraine context and the difference between where we have government support and private sector support. And this is just something, if you think of a country can intervene and offer support, whether that's military support, very much with as long as it takes. Whereas when we look at companies, Starlink, Microsoft, there's a tension still, whilst they can go in with good intention, it becomes increasingly expensive. When we saw this when Starlink, whilst part of it is covered by USAID, began to question what was the economic cost of still being long-term into a conflict. And there's different levels of tension, both audience costs from users of the technology who expect their companies to behave in a certain way, but also obligation to shareholders and where they feel their involvement is in the overall system, which is going to create challenges as these companies have more power throughout the internet stack. Next slide, please. So, as I said, there's 4 key problems that we looked at, particularly when we thought about what are the power global tech companies. And some of this comes to the companies don't necessarily, when they intervene, and often intervene, and if you look to the statements, it was out of moral obligation. They really took a stand on where they did, but that's not the best level of clarity for companies with this level of power within our cyber architecture. So we have to think about how do we work with companies if they're going to be coordinating with us for this level of cyber defense, whether we have clarity of when, where, and how they're going to intervene. If you could just click again, please. We also want to think about what's the consistency of their behavior. Are they going to do this equally across all instances? How are they judging when they're intervening? Their coherence, both at how they work together, but also their understanding of how their architecture is being used. One of the things that we see emerge with Starlink as a commercial company, then sort of expressed surprise at some point when they realized that their architecture was being used as part of the drone warfare, as part of the communication for drone warfare, which put them in an interesting position because they set up for military use of a commercial communications infrastructure, and how did this place them? And there were sort of questions opening of, does this then make commercial companies party to your conflict? So, and then legitimate targets for retaliation. And we also have to think about what's the commitment. How long are these companies going to be involved for, and how do we stabilize that level of commitment and also distribute it equally, because it's without a doubt massively expensive. So final slide, please. So I think one of the things that we think about, and one of the things that we've been looking towards recommendations, and how do we coordinate with tech companies for the next cyber-enabled geopolitical crisis, and very much sort of spaces like the NATO CCDOE, the Center of Excellence, that creates a multi-stakeholder space to be able to join both countries and companies to perhaps strategize on this, are going to become critical for that level of coordination. Thinking, the maxim has always been cyber defense is a team sport. It's never to one country alone, but it's never going to be to one company alone. And I think increasingly, though, we have to ask the companies are going to have to think about, even almost as part of their, whether that's at ESG or really thinking of their decision making on how they're going to be intervening in geopolitics. One of the questions often was that they didn't always have a robust geopolitical policy, and how are they going to, should they have some sort of crisis board that sort of helps them really understand the impacts of either minute action over the whole infrastructure, where we give them access to being part of the understanding of geopolitical decision making, and whether they should have some board to be able to coordinate between themselves, how they equitably distribute responsibility for cyber defense and cyber coordination in cooperation with states for long-term resilience. So that's wrapped it up for the moment, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie. Your presentation was really insightful and timely and fruitful. Melanie mainly focused on the cooperation happened during the Ukraine conflict, especially between the private companies and states. So we will talk about later in Q&A session altogether with Melanie. Thank you very much. And then I will move on to our third speaker, Dr. Pitriani Bintang Timur. Okay, we have, I think, 20 minutes ahead, so probably I need to speed up a little bit. So Fitri is a cybersecurity project lead and a senior researcher at the International Relations Department Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. Her research focus includes women, peace and security, peacekeeping, peace and mediation, security sector, reform and human rights, and cybersecurity. She obtained her PhD in security and defense studies from Cranfield University in the UK. She's a lecturer at the International Relations Department, University Indonesia, for module on transnational community and gender in international politics. So Fitri is also a member of UN ODA roster of experts on cyber resilience, cyber diplomacy, and co-chair of Women, Peace and Security Study Group of CISCAP. Okay, Fitri, it's your turn, please.
Thank you, Soyun, for your kind introduction, and thank you, AESCON 3, for having me. To answer the first question on what my definition on cyber resilience, for me, similar with other speakers, it's the ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from cyber threats and incidents while maintaining its essential function, system and operation. If you follow the basic NIST standards, what a cyber resilience component is, of course, there is prevention, detection, response, recovery, and adaptation to any cyber incident. But we need to know that despite the best effort to prevent cyber incident or attack, no system is completely immune, and therefore, as following what Melanie said, it is a team sport, and we continue to bolster our cooperation. And this goes to my presentation on how Asia and Europe might be in the same situation, but they might not be in the same ship or boat. One is a ship perhaps and one is a boat, because not every countries, especially the medium and smaller size countries, that the less mature digitally countries, have what it takes to foster its cyber resilience. Now, I want to say that we don't start in an empty platform. The ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Union, and European Union, for example, the ASEAN, Southeast Asian Nation and European Union have already a cybersecurity capacity building program. And the two regions work together in confidence building measures, as well protection on ICT-enabled critical infrastructure through the open-ended study group. However, we saw a concern on how the flashpoint in conflict situation, as perhaps mentioned by Melanie previously, in the Ukraine conflict. In Asia, we have also hit points such as the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, that is projected from the kinetic concern to the cyber tension. And we see, for example, how these play out in the critical infrastructure sector. And I will give the three main big issues. The energy sectors, how in the conflict of South China Sea, for example, it's the tension there, where the area contains huge amount gas and petroleum. There are multiple breaches of network of and companies that attempt to gain access and information about offshore oil exploration. The issue of telecommunication, we have threat actors and advanced persistent threat that tap into the firms and government, as well as military application targeted by providers, major telecommunication providers in Southeast Asia to monitor communication, as well as the APT, Advanced Persistent Threat 32, known as Ocean Lotus, that broken into computer of ASEAN member state, the government before the Leaders Summit, especially when the tension in South China Sea increases. This also impacted to other areas such as transportation with the hijacking of the flight information system, for example, in Vietnam, where the airport system have to be cut and therefore render it unuseful. Now, the question is, to what extent we are able to provide and support the small, medium, and less mature countries that have less economic or resources, both human resources and economic resources, to provide their cybersecurity, and whose responsibility is it, as it was said that we are as strong as our weakest link. So this is perhaps our task, to think of the greater goods, because the more prone infrastructure may be a proxy for a cyber incident. I guess because of the limited time, I will return to the moderator to open the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Fitri. Fitri presented more about the Indo-Pacific regions, the cyber resilience cooperation, and then the issues between the EU and ASEAN. And then I will now open to the floor. And then we have 15 minutes left. And then I got one question for now from the floor. I will, given it's from you Anita from area, given the enduring economic and the technological disparities between the northern hemispheres and the southern hemispheres, it is challenging to overlook the somber reality that establishing global cybersecurity cooperation faces obstacles, as evidenced by the limited number of countries willing to endorse the Budapest Convention, as Lorenzo mentioned before. And then the question is now then, how can we navigate the intricate issue of power imbalance in economic and technological power and convince countries that benefit from the lack of collaboration and agreement in cybersecurity? Who will the first? Dr. Lorenzo?
I mean, these are quite complex question, of course. My suggestion will be that, given that these imbalances, you know, I suggest that we should not follow the same pattern that, like, say, a more developing country have followed. In other words, I always like this idea of when we try to tackle norms, to try to develop what I call the regulatory leapfrogging approach. In other words, as has been done, for instance, for connectivity, in which basically, let's say, the more mature country in the EU, for instance, we started with a fixed network, and then we went to mobile. Instead, we have seen, how the mobile network have been a tremendous means, to develop connectivity in developing countries. Okay, the same can be done in terms of norms. In other words, we don't need to go to the same pattern that we had for the developing country. For instance, make a law first for network, then for product. This is what, for instance, the EU did. We have the NIS, and then we have now the CRA. Or for instance, think about, for instance, vulnerability disclosure. I think that, for instance, in Europe, we have this issue that, there is no certainty, not legal certainty for the disclosure of vulnerability, because, for instance, not proper, interpretation of the Budapest Convention, has created some type of lack of legal certainty for researchers that want disclose vulnerability. In less developing countries, to some extent, since you start from scratch, you can make legislation. They avoid some type of the mistake that have been made in developing countries. And this is because now technology is the same everywhere, exactly because the attacks are global, and so you can follow, let's say, a specific pattern related also to the type of development situation which you are. So I will I will suggest to follow this regulatory leapfrogging approach.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Melanie, do you have an opinion or answer?
Yeah, I think that part of it is to really look towards regional initiatives that can help empower across, as you said, if this is a team sport, and particularly places like the emerging Africa Cybersecurity Research Center that in Africa, that they came together and signed the Lomé Agreement. I think about 29 countries signed up to that, to sort of really push forward with centers of excellence regionally, where they can both be useful for sharing threat intelligence, but also to bring together academics, researchers, also private companies, very similar to working with NATO, CCDOE, doing those joint exercises, having that collaboration, so there can be a better ripple sharing of best practices, so that countries can join together with this. Particularly important also, South Pacific is particularly vulnerable, and with different sectors of there is less collaboration on this within ASEAN. And I think starting with concept of like more regional cyber domes, where we could create these regional umbrellas that can then interconnect as a whole, I think would be a good step forward and can help close some of the gap between lack of capacity in different individual countries and help all countries benefit.
Okay, thank you. What about Fitri?
Thank you for the question. Yes, of course, the issue of different resources is always a concern. And I agree with Melanie that the regional approach is one of the ways to tackle it, especially because of the computer emergency response team, the team that actually help if there is an incident. But the question is, to what extent would the vulnerability exposure bring, or even pointing if there's cyber incident, for example, would do, because I think Lorenzo mentioned it, because it would make a country look or even a company look that it would not or could not protect its cyber infrastructure, and that would render itself, weak or prone to attack. And then Indonesia is one of the countries that does not sign the Budapest Convention, because it is the question of sovereignty, for example, has been quite concerning, because one of the issues of the Budapest Convention, I think, would allow international team to come and investigate, and to what extent the countries that have experience of colonialization would allow that to happen. Now, having the entry point of regional organization is a soft landing for those countries to receive support and communicate in a certain common culture. For example, if we kind of discuss where is the European and the Asian are different in terms of maturity and model, of course, there's like big advanced technological countries in both sides, but to what extent is this big capability, technological capability, are being safe to the region as well? So sometimes we have a great power dynamics that is not conducive to the region, and we kind of need another region to come and balance it. So having the institutional framework, perhaps to have the role models of international norms that already adopted, like GDPR, in terms of information and data protection, for example, can be copied and implemented in other part, although it's not it's in its entirety. And perhaps it is something that is always a work in progress, but I would also say that it perhaps difficult to say that we can encourage the lesser developed, technological developed countries to just leapfrog, because it will fall into which direction and to who guides this leapfrog. So what happened if the country leapfrogs and it failed, for example? The cost is higher. And of course, as this smaller and medium country does not provide the technology by themselves, who would that country lean to, with technology provider that provides safety and security, and to what standard? So I think Lorenzo mentioned about the effort to develop a joint standard, or perhaps a common standard that is not dictated by big power, perhaps something that we can consider. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question. I'm afraid it will be the last one, because we have 5 minutes left, and but probably like yesterday, 2 to 3 minutes will be more allowed. Okay, so it's from Fanny Farmaki, the role of big tech companies in geopolitical crisis. And it reminds me of the role of private security and military companies in conflicts, and the debate on the challenges of their regulation in terms of accountability, obligations, etc., etc. And so the question is that, is there something to learn from that or similar experiences in devising a strategy and rule of engagement for big tech companies? I think Melanie will talk about it.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting analogy, and sort of some of the challenges that we've seen with private military companies, in particular, again, that aspect of, to the extent that they can become legitimate targets within a conflict, and also the extent that they have to, although not signatory to certain elements of international law, do they have to sort of adhere to it? And what has been interesting is some of the companies have been quite aware of some of these obligations and have drawn into, if you looked at particularly some of the questions about whether on Twitter, whether they could show pictures of prisoners of war, whether people sharing pictures of prisoners of war was actually a breach of like the Geneva Convention, like the Hague Convention, and that tension between things being against platform guidelines, against, where things sit with international law, and also where there's an obligation to have physical recording of incidents for if there's ever wanting to be future, justice processes on this, future judicial processes. So navigating that, and I think, these questions are really significant. I think for the same thing, private military companies operate slightly differently because their purpose is to be involved in the military. Private tech companies, that's not their purpose. Their purpose has come in to actually sustain an infrastructure, and a lot of their intervention on a moral belief of what they, of how they're questioning what's right, or even what they think their consumers think is right. And this is a different tension as well. Like, what do their users of their tech think they should be doing, which is another audience cost. And that's why I think a better part of this needs to be from the boardroom level within tech companies. They need to be thinking about what are the ripple effects of intervention, how they navigate it, and who they need on board to be able to help their decision making, to make sure that they've got that 360-degree view of a simple action of whether they withdraw internet from one country or whether they support internet in another country.
Thank you. What about other speakers, Lorenzo? Or
no, I mean, I agree with Melania. I mean, that it implies, the needs of the final governance also with the big tech in this context. Yeah.
What about Fitri? Do you?
It is an interesting question, because we know, although there are countries that disagree, the applicability of international law in the cyberspace, and we know who's the two countries that disagree of the applicability of that law in the cyberspace. But companies, how do you regulate that, especially when companies are operating between borders, transnational, and who are they responsible to? What are they responsible to gain the most profitable position? And what about the countries or the war and conflict that is not profitable? Who would who would they follow? This is an issue, and I guess it is a question. For example, the development of AI, for example, and I heard that yesterday European Union have made that draft the most advanced in the world, and how to regulate an AI, But again, right, if we want to start with a regulation, and we know that the companies are the one that is most advanced and come out with that innovation, if we actually start with a regulation, to what extent we can regulate something that is not yet transpire and develop in a closed door? So how do we call these companies to be transparent? Of course, the board. And then, yeah, just like Melanie and Lorenzo, I think only the privileges can have access, and how we can push it to open, especially when that private actually kind of developing together with the national military as well. So yeah, it's an interesting question, but I think we need time to answer that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all of our great speakers for your presentation. And then we are now the closing time, and then after we will have a break time for 15 minutes, and then we will come back to until 10:20 by CEST. Yeah, so we will have a 15 minutes break time. Okay, see you later, guys.